One of the most useful components that we build in Power Apps are dialog components. These are used to interrupt a user to either notify them of additional information or to require them to take action on something like a confirmation. As with many website components that we've looked at, there's a version of this dialog component that uses Fluent UI design. In this video, we'll look at how to create the Fluent UI React dialog component in Power Apps. We'll create the component in such a way that it can be repurposed across many screens, multiple situations, and any app. So let's get started. A good place to start when trying to build a custom component in Power Apps is to look at the documentation for the component that you're trying to recreate. In this case, we're looking at the Fluent UI documentation for the dialog component. We can see that the dialog is to be used as a supplemental surface, and they are to be used for important actions only, since they directly interrupt the user. If we scroll down, we can see that there are many different types of dialogs. A modal dialog stops the user from interacting with the content behind it. So you might use this when you need the user to interact with the dialog before doing anything else in your app. A non-modal dialog, on the other hand, sits on top of the page's content but doesn't block the user from interacting with the content behind it. You can use these dialogs for alerts as well, since an alert is just a modal dialog. Next, let's look at the behavior of the dialog component. For dismissal of the dialog, you can see that in a modal dialog, we wouldn't want to include a dismissal icon in the top right corner, in addition to a cancel button. These two would be redundant, and the dismissal icon can be hidden instead. It's best to keep a dialog simple, so we'll be focusing on a version of this component that only contains two actions. For scrolling, we want the content of our dialog to be scrollable if it's too tall to fit in the dialog. You can also opt to make the height of the dialog dynamic, depending on the height of the content up to the size of the user's screen, and that's what we'll opt to do in our component. This section of the documentation shows the basic layout of the dialog, which we will be creating in our Power App. It contains three sections for a header, which includes header text and a dismiss icon, body content, and a footer containing up to 3 actions. As I said before, we'll be creating 2 actions for simplicity's sake today, but a good exercise to try on your own would be to add a 3rd action. Just some final information on the content of the dialog before we dive into creating it. The first thing is to always communicate your main information in the title of the dialog. Don't use too general of wording, and instead use descriptive words that give the user a good idea of what you're trying to bring to their attention. Next, the body of the dialog isn't required by any means, but it's a good place to give information and additional context. It's important to note, though, that you shouldn't just restate the header text. Lastly, the button labels should always be a response to the header text. The example given here is that the title of delete this file could have buttons labeled as delete and cancel. You wouldn't want the buttons to say delete this file and cancel and close the record, for example. Always try to keep these buttons to 1 or 2 words for simplicity's sake. With all that covered, we have a good foundation for what we're trying to accomplish in our Power App. So let's head over to our app and we'll start building. We'll first navigate to our components and we'll add a new component named Fluent UI Dialog. As we saw in the Fluent documentation, the dialog control has a lot of customizability and options that we have to build into our component. We'll start by adding our custom properties. The first one will be modal, which will be an input boolean, which defines whether the instance of our component is used as a modal or non-modal instance. The header will be an input text property containing the header text for the dialog box. Next up is the body, which will be an input text property, which will populate with the body text for our dialog. Next, we'll create a property called primary button, and this will be an input of type record. This will be where we define the primary button's text and styling. We'll also create another record input for secondary button. Next, we'll create 2 event properties. These will be the primary button on select and the secondary button on select. These event properties are where we can populate what we want the component to do when either the primary button or the secondary button are selected. Next, we need an output Boolean property called Dialog visible. While there will be a regular visible property for this component when it's inserted on a screen, we need a way to programmatically set the visibility of our component in a way that's reusable across many apps. Because of this, the visibility of our component needs to be communicated through a custom property rather than through an external variable in the Power App. We'll also add an action property called setVisibility. This is a function we'll call when we need to change our component's visibility property on a screen. Close button will be a Boolean input designating whether we have a close button available in the top right corner of the dialog box. Dialog width is going to be a number input, and this will let us determine what the width of our dialog box should be when inserted on a screen. Dialog height is going to be a data output of type number, and we'll use this to calculate what the height of our component should be automatically. Now let's set some defaults for all these custom properties. For our header, we'll just replace text with header. And for body, we'll do the same, replacing text for body. This will just give us some descriptive text when the controls are inserted on the screen. For our primary button, we'll insert a record with curly brackets, and we'll insert the following text. We want two properties inside of our button, one for item display name, which in this placeholder, we'll just type primary button, and then a second field for item type, which corresponds with the type of the button from the button control. So these can be either primary, secondary, subtle, transparent, or outline. In this case, we'll just set it to primary. We'll go ahead and copy this record and paste it into our secondary button. For our secondary button, we'll replace the primary text with secondary, and we'll also set the type as secondary. For our primary button on select property, we'll go ahead and set this to the notify function, and we just want to notify that the primary button was selected. We'll copy this and we'll paste it into our on select for our secondary button. And we want this to say that the secondary button was selected. In the set visibility event, we'll use a set function to set a variable to the opposite of its current value. So in this case, we'll say set var dialog visible to the opposite of var dialog visible. With this variable set, we can go to our dialog visible property and set this to var dialog visible. From our app, we can trigger this event to either make our component visible or invisible on the screen. For our close button toggle, we'll set this to the opposite value of self.modal. By default, if the component is modal, we want to turn off the close button so that the user has to take action with one of the action buttons. If it is non-modal, then we want the close button to be shown. This can of course be modified when the component is actually inserted on a screen. For our dialog width, we'll set this to 500 for now, and we're going to leave dialog height alone until we've built our component. So let's get started on that now. First, we'll insert a vertical container in our component named container dialog component. We want the justification and the alignment to be centered for this one, and we'll set both the x and y values to 0. The width of this container should be parent.width, and the height should be parent.height, so that the container spans the whole area of the component. We also want the drop shadow to be set to none with a border radius of 0. In the color property of this container, we want to insert a formula to check if our component is modal or non-modal. If you recall from the Fluent documentation, a modal dialog prevents the user from clicking the background and interrupts the user's actions. This is signaled to the user by darkening the background behind the dialog. We'll insert the following formula into our color property to do this in our component. If parent.modal equals true, then we want an RGBA value of 000.05. If it's false, we want it to be transparent, so we'll leave it at all zeros for RGBA. Parent.modal returns a true or false value, so we can shorten the formula to remove equals true, since it's already returning a true or false value to our if function. Next, we'll insert a vertical container into our dialog component container, and we'll call this container dialog. This container is going to have a gap of 8, and then we'll set the padding on all sides to 24. We'll set the drop shadow to bold, and we'll keep the border radius at 4. If you want a more rounded dialog pop-up, you can increase the border radius. Or if you want it squared off, you can enter 0. We'll make our height and width dynamic later, but for now we'll just disable stretch for width and flexible height, and we'll set our width to 600 and our height to 200. We also want the color of our dialog box to be white, so we'll go ahead and choose that. Inside our dialog container, let's insert a new horizontal container named container header. We'll set the vertical alignment to centered, the gap to 8, and the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0. We also want to set the height to 40 and the drop shadow to none. This container is going to hold our header text for the pop-up as well as our close button if we want to have one. So we'll first insert our text control and we'll name this label header. The text of this label is going to be set to Fluent UI dialog.header. We'll go ahead and set the vertical alignment for the text in the control to middle, and then we'll enable the flexible width option with a minimum width of 0. For our text formatting, we'll set the font size to 20 and the weight to semi-bold. Now we'll insert our close button. We'll go ahead and insert a button control in our header container, and we'll name it button close. We'll set the icon of this button to dismiss and the layout to icon only. We want the text alignment to be centered and the width to be 32. Right now our button is set to the primary type, so we'll switch this to be the subtle option. We also want the icon style to be filled, and we want the font size to be 24. In the onSelect property of our button, we want to trigger our set visibility event from our component. So we'll enter Fluent UI dialog.setVisibility. There are no parameters to our setVisibility function, so that's why we leave the parenthesis empty. If we did have parameters associated with our event, we would enter those in the parenthesis. We also only want our close button to be visible when our close button custom property is true. So we'll go to the visible property of our button, and we'll set this to Fluent UI dialog.closeButton. With our header container done, we'll move on to our body. In our dialog container, we'll insert a text control named label body. The text property for this control will reference our body custom property from our component. We'll go ahead and set the wrap property to true, and we'll enable the auto height property. The width should be set to stretch with a minimum width of 0. Very importantly, we'll also need to set the text alignment to middle. I know that doesn't look like it did anything, but there's a bug currently with the auto height feature. When the vertical alignment is set to top, it will always show a scroll bar on certain screen sizes, whereas with auto height turned on, there should not be any scroll bars visible. The next thing we need to do is create our action buttons. We'll go ahead and insert a horizontal container in our dialog container, and we'll name it container buttons. We want the justification for this to be right or end justified, and the vertical alignment for the container's contents should be centered. Let's also set the gap to 8, and we'll set the container to stretch with a minimum width of 0. For now, the height of this container should be 40, and we'll set the drop shadow to none. In this container, we'll start by inserting a button named button primary. We'll set the text property of our primary button to our primary button custom property .item display name. We'll also set the layout to text only, and for the type, we'll set this to our primary button's custom property .item type. Now in the onSelect property, we'll need to trigger our custom event property for our button. So on the primary button's onSelect, we'll enter Fluent UI dialog.primarybutton onSelect. We're doing it this way because we don't want the onSelect functions of each button to be hard-coded to the button. Instead, we want to be able to enter the onSelect functions dynamically, depending on which screen we're inserting the control on and what action we're trying to get the user to take. Now we'll go ahead and copy our primary button and we'll paste it in our button container. We'll rename this copy to button secondary. Now we just need to change the references to our primary button and our primary button on select to secondary button and secondary button on select. If we click our primary button, we can see it notifies us that that button was selected. And if we click our secondary button, we can now see that the secondary button was selected. Now the text of our buttons might vary depending on what we put into the button. So we want the width of these buttons to be dynamic. We're going to use a trick using the HTML control to make this happen. The basic plan with this is to use the HTML control to rotate our button's text by 90 degrees. If we have the auto height property enabled on our HTML control, then technically the control's height property should tell us what the width of our button should be. We'll go ahead and insert an HTML control at the top level of our component, and we'll name it HTML primary button height. We need this to be visible, but we'll do some things later to hide the text so that the user can't see it. The first thing we'll do is enable auto height, and we'll set our font size to 15. The button control has a default font size of 14, but we need to size up to 15 to provide some extra padding on the sides of the buttons. For the HTML control, we'll also set the padding on all sides to 0, and we'll send this to the back of the component so that it doesn't interfere with the user clicking on the dialog box. Next, we'll head to our HTML text property, and we'll enter in some code here, starting with a $sign. We'll enter a div, and for the style properties, we want the display to be inline block. We want the margin to have some padding of 30 pixels on the left and right. We want the position to be relative. We want to transform the text by rotating it 90 degrees. We want the origin of this transformation to occur from the top left corner of our text. And we want to set our white space to no wrap. We'll enter a single quote and close our div tag, and then we'll enter in curly brackets a reference to our primary button's text property. After that, we'll close our div and we'll enter a quotation mark to close our formula. With that done, we can now see that our vertical text is showing the text of our primary button. We'll head to our primary button, and then we'll set the width to the height of our HTML primary button height control. You can see that the button now automatically adjusts to the size of the text in the control. We'll head back to our HTML control, and we'll go to the text color property. We want this text to be invisible, so we'll set the alpha value of the text color to 0. Next, let's make a copy of our HTML control and we'll paste it into our component. We'll rename it to HTML secondary button height, and we'll replace the reference in the text property for our primary button to our secondary button. We'll also go ahead and send this to the back of our component. With this done, we'll replace our secondary button's width with the height of our secondary button HTML control. To also account for the possibility of our buttons being too wide to fit into the dialog box, we'll make our button container's height dynamic. First, we'll enable the wrap property on our button container, and then we'll head to the height property. We'll insert the max function at the beginning, and we want to take the maximum value of either 40 or our secondary button's Y value plus its height value. This way, if our secondary button gets pushed to a new line, our container will adjust accordingly. On that note, we also want a way to hide the buttons altogether. We'll select the visible property of our primary button, and we'll enter isNotBlank Fluent UI Dialog.primary button. This will check if our primary button information is blank, and only if it is not will it show the button. We'll copy this formula over to our secondary button's visible property as well, and we'll replace the reference to our primary button with our secondary button. For our buttons container, we want a way to hide this container if both of the buttons are invisible. We'll head to the container's visible property, and we'll set this to buttonPrimary.visible or buttonSecondary.visible. If either buttons are visible, the container will be visible. If both buttons are hidden, the container will be hidden, and the height of the dialog will adjust accordingly once we make a few changes. We've created the basics of our dialog, so now let's do some things to clean it up. First, we want to make the height of our dialog box adjust automatically to the height of the text inside it, up to the maximum height of the screen. We'll select our dialog container, and we'll insert a vertical container called container height. We'll set the container's width to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll disable the flexible height option and set the height to 1. We'll also go ahead and set the drop shadow for this container to none. The purpose of this container is to sit at the bottom of our dialog container, and this will give us a way to tell what the height property of our dialog container should be. Since the container will always be at the bottom of our dialog container, its Y property is what we want to set as our dialog container's height. We'll head to our dialog container and then select the height property. In here, we'll enter container height.y. Now we also want to allow this to expand all the way up to the height of the app, but we don't want it to go above the height of our app. So we'll enter a min function at the beginning of this formula. We'll take the minimum value of either container height.y or app.height. We also have some padding at the bottom of our container, so we'll want to add self.paddingBottom to our container height.y property. Again, this formula will take either the smaller value of container height.y plus self.paddingBottom or the app's height. With that done, we also want to make our width of the component dynamic based on certain conditions. You'll recall from the Fluent UI documentation that a non-modal dialog should allow the user to interact with objects in the background. Because of this, we need the height and the width of the component to not take up the whole screen if the component is set to non-modal. If it is modal, we want to stop the user from taking action by filling the entire screen. To accomplish this, we'll first go to our component's properties. For the width property, we'll insert the following formula. If self.modal equals true, then the size of this should be app.width. Otherwise, it should be the minimum of self.dialogWidth or app.width. This will check if our modal property is true, and if so, it will set the component's width to the whole screen's width. If it is false, we want to set the width of the component to the minimum, or the smaller, in this case, value between our dialog width property and the app's width. This will make it adjust dynamically on smaller screen devices. With this done, we'll head to our dialog container's width property and enter the following formula. We want the minimum value between Fluent UI dialog.dialogWidth minus 64 or app.width minus 24. This is taking the minimum value between our dialog width property minus 64 to account for the drop shadow area around the component, or the app's width minus 24 in the case of small screen devices. Our dialog box will automatically adjust its size depending on which number best suits the view of the user's screen. We'll go to our custom output property called dialog height, and we'll set this value to our dialog container's height plus 84 to account for the drop shadow around the container. Then we'll go to our component's height property, and we'll set it to the following. If self.modal, then app.height. Otherwise, self.dialogHeight. If our app is modal, the component will take up the entire height of the screen, blocking the user from interacting with the components behind it. If it's non-modal, then the height of our component will reference our dialog height property, which is automatically calculated based on the height of our dialog container, plus some extra padding for the drop shadow. Now that we've got our component set up, let's go test it out. We can see our default values for our text and our buttons, and we'll head to the visible property of the component and set this to self.dialogVisible. Currently this value is blank, so we can't see it on the screen. Next, we'll insert a button on the screen, and in the onSelect property, we want to trigger our dialog component's setVisibility command. Now we can see that when we select our button, the dialog appears. If I send my button to the back of the screen, we can see that I'm not able to select it again since our component is set to modal. Let's go ahead and turn modal off. We'll go to our component and we'll toggle the modal option off. Now we can see that our component dynamically resizes so that it's not taking up the whole screen, and we get a close button in the top right corner. For a non-modal dialog, we'd typically want this to be centered on the screen. So we'll set the x property to parent.width divided by 2 minus self.width divided by 2. Similarly, for the y property, we'd set this to parent.height divided by 2 minus self.height divided by 2. We can see with the non-modal dialog, I can still interact with the button that's technically behind the dialog. So clicking on it triggers that set visibility command and hides the dialog. Let's also test our close button. We can click on the X in the top right corner of our component, and we can see that it is dismissed. Testing our primary button, we can see that we're notified that the primary button is selected. And the same goes for the secondary button. Now, after one of these buttons is clicked, not only do we want to trigger the onSelect function of our component, but we also want this dialog to close. And that's something that we can hardcode into our buttons. So we'll head back to our component, we'll select our primary button, and we'll go to the onSelect property. After our event is triggered, we want to trigger our setVisibility command. We'll go ahead and copy this, and we'll also add that to our secondary button. Returning to our screen, we can see that when we click on primary button, we're notified that the primary button was selected, and the dialog disappears. We can change our dialog width to see that it expands and contracts appropriately. Let's play our app and we'll switch it to a mobile view to confirm that it shrinks accordingly to the mobile screen. We can also confirm that if the screen size is smaller than our dialog width, then the dialog box shrinks accordingly. Let's take a look at a real example next. Here we have one of the basic screen templates that are given to us in Power Apps. We have a table on the left-hand side with a form on the right, as well as a toolbar up above. This toolbar has a delete button, which is removing our selected record from the table from our data source. Instead of removing the record directly with this button, we'd instead want to show our dialog component as a confirmation. We'll go ahead and select our screen, and then we'll insert our dialog component. As we did before, we'll go to our visible property, and we'll set this to self.dialogVisible. Now with our delete button, instead of triggering the remove function directly in this button, we instead want to trigger the setVisibility command from our component. Now when we select this button, our component is shown. For our header text, we might enter something like confirm deletion. For the body text, we might enter, are you sure you want to delete the selected person's name? For our primary button's display name, we'll just enter in delete. And for the secondary button, we'll enter cancel. We'll keep the dialog width at 500, and we'll also keep the close button disabled, as it's disabled by default because we have the modal option enabled. We'll head to the Advanced tab, and for the primary button on select, this is where we'd want to enter our remove function. So rather than the initial button actually deleting the record, we have this confirmation that the user has to select delete again in order to remove the record from the data source. For our secondary button, we'll just remove the notify function. Since we already have it hard-coded that the button will trigger our setVisibility command, we don't want it to trigger any other actions. So by leaving this empty, the only thing it'll do is hide the dialog. So let's try it out. We'll go ahead and select a record, and then we'll go ahead and hit the delete button. We can see that it asks us to confirm the deletion. Are you sure you want to delete this person? And if we go ahead and click on delete, it'll go ahead and remove this person from the data source. As another example, we have a table with a list of contacts, and above the table we have an information button. In this information button, we're checking if there is a selected row in the table, and if there is, then we're triggering our component's set visibility event. If I select a row and click on our button, now you can see our dialog appears. Selecting the dialog, I really just want this to be informational, so I'll remove the contents of our primary and secondary buttons. And you can see that the height of our dialog adjusts accordingly. For our header, we'll enter contact information. And for the body, we'll enter in some information about the selected user from our table. Using the char function, along with the value of 10, can implement breaks into our text control, so we can add these different values onto new lines. If we select one of our rows and we click on the information button again, you can see that it displays the information about the currently selected record. Now, since this is non-modal, we can also select more records behind it. If I were to enable the modal option, you can see this would take up the entire screen, and I can no longer select records behind the dialog. And that's about it. If you have any questions about this component, please leave a comment below. And if you're interested in future videos on Fluent UI components and modern controls, consider subscribing to the channel. Have a great day.